intro the topic because it's kind of your idea.
Okay.
So you kind of have a thought of what you want to talk about, yeah?
I'll do it live. I'll do it on the night. Do it live! Do it live! Fuck it, we'll do it live!
All right. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Accidental Survivors. This is Fraser.
This is Chris.
And this is Todd.
And we just had a little bit of robot Chris there, so I'm concerned we might have another episode like last one where Chris just disappears partway through.
Yeah, disappearing partway through, that's my gig, dude.
Don't steal it. Maybe when Rob shows up, Chris will just disappear. Rob will take over.
I'll just drop off entirely.
Hey, so what are we drinking? Let's start with you, Chris.
I have a nothing special today, just a Waterloo Dark.
That's pretty special.
Nothing fancy. We'll go
There
with
you
that.
go.
Yeah.
Awesome sauce. And Todd?
I'm going with the Mill Street Organic. It's something that actually I got it from you when one time went for a game where you had brought some of this over and there was like 3 or 4 bottles left over and you literally just dumped it to the first person willing to take it. And I like it. I'm normally not a lager guy, but this one, it kind of sticks to me a little bit. It's actually starting to become like my go-to favorite.
I know if I drink a lot of lager, it sometimes sticks to me too.
Oh, gut jokes.
Sometimes when I drink a lot of lager, Chris sticks to me.
Hey now. Wait a minute.
Oh, shower room jokes.
It's not usually where I'm doing my drinking.
No, that's usually alone in the bathroom with sobbing with your tears.
It's a picture of Chris that's sticking to me. There we go. But I'm also I'm beerless as well. But so I've got a finishing off a bottle of Inniskillen Late Autumn Riesling white wine, which is certainly fine. We ended up, one of my buddies was up from Halifax, so all the beer that I had, I contributed to that particular visit. And I've been beerless since.
And now you're drinking wine. Now, Does that come with, like, I know when I get beer, I get like a belt or a hat or whatever in the case. When you buy that, does it come with a purse?
Yes, it does.
Excellent. That's really good. That's wonderful.
It's a very nice black velvet purse with a picture of Elvis.
Oh,
So,
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's good.
I'm feeling pretty rock and roll right now.
Does it come with a beret?
I already have one of those, so it's all good. From when I bought my last bottle of wine. But, okay, cool. Hopefully Rob will be able to join us later on. But, Todd, you had a good topic that you wanted to chat about, so bring us up to speed.
Yeah, so I know, and this has been an issue that I've had when it comes to game mastering, and it's been one that is really starting to come to light as of late with my work on, wait for the plug, screenplay. Ooh, subtle, coming out October 20th. And it's basically just being able to run games in not so much a timely fashion, but being able to move the story along at a certain pace where you're able to achieve certain goals and milestones. So like in a 4 to 5 hour game, to me as the GM, it always feels as if the story's moving much slower than I had planned on, than I had expected. And it's just always been something where every single time after, I'm driving away and I'm going home, I say to myself, I could have done this better, I could have done that better. And then when the next time comes along, it's either exactly the same or I've actually become worse. And it turns out it's like, my God, it's like we opened a door in an hour and a half. Like, what the fuck just happened? So I'm kind of wanted to throw this out there to you guys, experienced GMs, and let's just kind of, riff on it and start to talk about this kind of issue, basically just pace and speed and everything when it comes to gaming.
That was your first mistake, asking us for advice. Your second mistake was doing it on a podcast.
Junior.
Beside getting into a land war in Asia.
Yes.
First and foremost, you're the only ones that will actually, let me go onto a podcast and riff about it. Second of which, you're the only people that will actually pick up my phone calls. So I'm kind of stuck with you guys on this.
The first one I obviously disagree with because you've had a chat with a frog. So
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, too, I don't, like I'd like to get a human take on, on game mastering before I go with the aquatic amphibian angle.
And there will be a link in the documents to the Dr. Frog podcast that's got Todd on it. Yeah. So in thinking about this, because the first thing that I said to Todd when he brought this up was like, well, if people are having fun, is it a problem? And I mean, that's sidestepping the issue, and you're very correct in saying, yeah, but there are things I want to get done, and that's the issue, not if we're having fun. So I mean, let's just get that out of the way. I think, as I was thinking about it, one of the words that you mentioned, milestones, to me was very critical. If there's something that you want to get done within a set period of time, be that 3 hours, 4 hours, whatever, I think you do need to set milestones. And when you're writing an adventure, it is often very much like writing a story or a novel, so there's pacing involved, which means you should have a pretty good idea of where you should be in the story at a certain time frame. And this is specifically if there's something you want to get done within that time frame. And I think milestones are a good way to measure that. So, I mean, if you expect to be, I don't know, to a certain, so you've got a 4-hour space and you're kind of ramping up to the action. So you expect by 2 hours in, you might not necessarily be halfway through, but because maybe the tail end of your adventure is where all the action is happening, and that's going to go relatively fast or slow depending on what system you want. But I mean, you should know at which time things are supposed to happen. So if you're creeping up on that time, I mean, have your watch out there that you're looking at, so you know if you're creeping up at that time and you're not there, there's got to be things that you can condense. And if it does come down to skipping certain scenes, if they're not crucial, you can do that, or just push ahead. Like, the biggest problem for me in thinking about this is the one thing that I don't want to do is try to shut down the players having fun. And that is one of the things, the social non-game aspect of it, especially for those people that don't get together very regularly, can be one of the things that really does take away, not ruins, but sucks up time. But if you have something that you really want to get done or need to get done, especially like, I mean, the one thing that I'm thinking of is con games, but that isn't the only spot, as Todd said. At a certain time when you realize, okay, I'm behind or I'm ahead or whatever, sometimes you do have to just say, okay, let's just push through this. This scene was going to be where we're going to do this. Let's do it a real quick narrative or something else and get going. And that should also clue you in that you've got a problem and that you might want to try to cut. Because there are social cues you can use to have people stop their conversations, even very directly saying, okay, how about we get moving on this scene, this is what's going to happen, that sort of thing. I mean, that's just the very like global top level first thing that I could think of.
Yeah, I think that there's two ways to approach it, and one is just kind of to try and stop the table talk. But as you pointed out, like, so in our games, we only see each other like once a month maybe or so. So initially it kind of starts out slow as everybody sort of gets back into the pace of it, and we get caught up with what's been going on for a month, and then the game gets going. But then there's also sort of just the in-game banner that crops up because we're friends. So, I mean, we've got history together, so jokes that have happened in previous games or whatever's come up, they repeat, and then it kind of takes you out of the moment. So I think one way that when I'm running a game, I try to keep going is that when that starts happening, I don't tell them to try and shut them up. I make something happen. Yep. So it pulls them back into the game. And then the other thing I've tried to do lately, which from a very traditional game kind of background for most of the guys we play with, is sort of new to some of them, is actually phasing over the non-important stuff. So It's very easy, like traditional gamers sort of have this sort of, I don't know, you get bogged down in the nitty-gritty of like, well, how do we do this? How do we get from A to B? What happens along the way? Do we have enough provisions? Do we da-da-da-da-da? Because in traditional gaming, that was sort of what you did. The story was not, I shouldn't say not as important, but mechanically the story was less relevant than, how long does it take me to get from A to B? Is there enough rations? How many encounters? Do we worry about marching order? All that sort of stuff, which all takes time. And if you're just traveling from, from here to there, and you don't want anything to happen, then when you get players that are sort of prepping for that, that's a lot of wasted time. So what I've been doing lately is just sort of generally phasing over that stuff. I might, kind of say, okay, this is sort of the situation. What are you prepping for, like very loosely? But I don't really care about marching order and all that thing. I want to get from the fun stuff to the next set of fun stuff. And then all that mundane stuff sometimes will work in emails, or kind of do like a time lapse sort of thing after the fact, or maybe some foreshadowing, or while you guys were doing this happened. Kind of work that boring stuff sort of out of the story, because again, we only play somewhat infrequently, so the more actual good action gaming we can get done, that to me is more valuable time, because if we just want to shoot the shit, we don't have to be playing, we could be doing anything. And then when it comes down to actual getting stuff done, I think that's where I try and keep the pace on, and when people start getting acting up, or a very common thing will be rules discussions over something, it might be something that at the time seems pretty important, but and those little details, that's very easy to get bogged down into that conversation. And I know, like, when we were first gaming, that happened, I'd say, relatively frequently, and that could derail an entire game, when really the argument might be, is do I get +2 to hit? Or something very simple. So now I'll just say, you know what, screw it, and I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, or I'll just say, this is what it is, deal with it. And then after the fact, I'll go and really look up a rule and say, this happened this time, but next time this is how we're going to handle it. Now, I've also started, like, the games that I play now, like, so 5e, Fantasy Flights, Warhammer, Star Wars, Marvel, kind of Feng Shui. These are, although they're not narrative story games, they're still a lot looser than a very hard, grindy, traditional game. So it does give me, as a DM, a lot more flexibility, that I'm not having to bog down into those mechanics as often, because usually, like, all right, if I'm fretting a detail, say, here, have an advantage, like for 5e. All right, have advantage or disadvantage. Don't worry about how we get there. Like, that's the end result, and that's usually sufficient to carry that mechanical situation forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, the part you mentioned too about rules discussion and stuff, I think that's something that because aside from that little bit when I was running some D&D 5e, a large majority of the games I run are ones that I've created, and a lot of games that I play in are ones that someone else has created. And so inevitably rules discussions come into it. To a certain point, eventually we will start to cap things off and say, okay, this is getting really too bogged down, so why don't we just keep going with it for now? I'll keep that in mind, and we'll address it the next time in emails. I can even remember sometimes too, actually, in some of the screenplay play tests, where poor Dan, who is not a game mechanics guy, the rest of us just start getting into is like, what if it was this, and what if instead of steps, we work with a straight modifier or with a die roll and everything, and looking over to the other end of the table and actually seeing Dan just slowly drifting off to sleep, looking very much like my 3-month-old, just all of a sudden crying 1 minute and then and then it's out. So I mean, like, yeah, granted, and that goes along with joking along and everything else like that. So which a lot of my games are guilty of, and I think that maybe one of the things that I have, I don't know if I'd even call it a weakness, because for me, I look at being the GM as being the entertainment for the night. I take that as you're being the host, not only just for the game and the story that's being told, but for the evening in general. And I think that's where a lot of some of my delays can really kind of come into play, because if everyone's joking and having a good time, I like to see that everyone's having a good time. That's a sign that everyone is having fun. And then to a certain point, and then eventually things start to get a little on the ridiculous side. So right. That the out of game discussions, I think, is definitely something that is a bit of it's a weakness, but at the same time too, I also kind of see that as a strong point. If people are talking about the mechanics because it's something I've been designing, that's very beneficial for me, and I like to know that people are actually talking about it, because then that means that they give a shit. It's not so much as like, oh man, I'll just play this thing just to keep him quiet.
Right, but if that's the case, then you don't really have a problem. If
Yeah.
all you want is for people to have fun, then the timings aren't the issue. But if timings are an issue, I think what Chris mentioned, like have a pop, like have a scene that gets people's attention. One thing you might even want to do is have a couple things in your back pocket, like certain transitional scenes that can fit in multiple places in your narrative, so that if things are slowing down, this is something that is going to snap, it's going to get people's attention, it's going to kind of freak them out a little bit. Either it's action, or it's a new NPC, or it's an NPC that they know before, that when this NPC shows up, shit happens. Something like that to get them focused and also a little bit excited, because again, if it's a scene that's supposed to be like a pop to get everyone's attention, I mean it should be something that is not only going to get their attention but also get them excited, because it's generally going to be action, or again like an NPC that they know or expect something from, something that's going to draw their attention and enthusiasm. We do have the Q&A running, and I didn't forget this time, so I opened it up. And Victor Wyatt, who's a longtime friend of the show and a Gen Con buddy, one of the reasons I love going to Gen Con is to see my buddies like Victor, he's asking, is there an optimal pace when playing an RPG, or is it just planning plot points for the evening? I mean, I have an opinion, but I'd like you guys to, if you guys have something to say, to jump in so that it's not the Fraser show.
That's a good question. I think it's going to come down to the type of game you're running. So if you're running, I'm going to fall back again on traditional sort of gaming because that's my forte. But when I think you can plan out, if you know how long your session's going to be, you should by now, like if you've been doing this for a little while, at least you kind of have a good idea of how long an average combat should run. Or if it's like a series of smaller combats, say you're rushing a dungeon sort of thing, you can plan. If you know how long those action scenes take, then if you've got what's a con sessions, usually about 4 hours, I think.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So within that time frame, there's going to be the ramp up. That's based on what I've been into, maybe half an hour there to kind of get everything going, or 45 minutes you want to factor in there to settle in, which usually leaves you a solid, you can plan for a good 2 hours of combat with another hour, plus or minus of filler, maybe some wrap up, depending on what you're trying to get out of that con session. Like if you're, what do you guys think? I want to run this again, feedback. So if you figure you've got 2 action scenes with about an hour apiece, then that gives you an hour worth of other stuff to fill in. So that is the hard part, I would say. In terms of pacing that, though, really the key is to give the players something to do so that they're not falling into those patterns of talking amongst themselves. I would say in a con game that's probably easier to do because you have generally strangers, so they don't have that back history there. So they're maybe a little more focused on the game itself because that's sort of the unifying thing that's brought them together. They're not there to chat with their buddies. So you might be able to get a little more accomplished, but that's sort of the pacing. The thing that I've seen in a lot of games lately is basing everything around the 3-act. So you got 3-act, 3 scenes, 3 scenes in I forget how it branches out. So I kind of use that as my model. So in an evening, I try and have 3 acts, so 3 action scenes, or 3 action scenes, and each action scene might have based on sort of 3 sort of sequences to the combat. And by that I mean, I get to the warehouse, that's scene 1, investigate the warehouse, scene 2, and then the fight breaks out. That would be the 3rd scene. And then the next act is that's the transition from what happens after the fight to what are we going to do next. That's the 1st scene. Getting there is probably the 2nd scene, and then whatever, the action element breaks out. So in a given evening, if I'm pacing this right and kind of keep everybody on focus within 4 hours, probably for me about 3 scenes with that sort of framework I can usually pull off. Doesn't mean it always works. Like some sessions will get 1 act in of 1 scene, but that's my goal.
And Rob has joined us. Hey, Rob.
Hello.
Rob!
I made it. You don't pay the ransom. I escaped.
Excellent.
Well, that's good because we weren't going to.
Exactly. We had spent it on booze. So.
Yeah. The ransom has already been spent.
I was
But,
going to say, I was planning on collecting that ransom, so it's like, foiled again.
You got
Oh,
away.
Rob got out of your basement, Todd.
If I only had a nickel every time I heard that. We're answering Victor Wyatt's question. We're doing the Q&A.
Okay.
So his question, which Chris was chatting about, is there an optimal pace when playing an RPG, or is it just planning plot points for the evening? And plug for myself, Nefertiti Overdrive. One of the things
Because we all know that's all this podcast is a vehicle for your products.
That and Warren Ellis, yes. But so one of the things in adventure creation in Nefertiti Overdrive is there's a volume to each scene, and it's quiet, which is like a 0, or a 5, and then loud, and that refers to if you're going to be using dice. So a quiet scene is dice aren't necessary. A 5 is dice might come out. It depends on how you want to run it. And then a 10 is, there's going to be dice. Like, this is a mechanical scene. One of the reasons that I did that was to actually pace out adventures. So generally in the adventures that now, the ones that are published are mostly for con use, which means that they're based on 4 hours. So I can't lengthen them out as much as I would like. But how I like to set it up is start it with a loud scene, an action scene, because that generally gets people invested, and then move that into a 5, because there's generally something that a fallout from that action that might or might not use dice. There's a lot of things in Nefertiti Overdrive you don't really need to use dice, but you can if you want. And then follow that with a couple of quiet scenes. And that's usually stuff meeting NPCs, doing investigations, that sort of thing. And then there's actually a rhythm where you're getting fewer and fewer quiet scenes and more loud scenes until the climax, where you've got 2 or 3 loud scenes all at once. Generally, and again, because it's based on wuxia movies, you've got the tail end is generally a crowd of mooks, a fewer number of super tough guys, and then the boss fight, right? So you've got those loud scenes. But that's not necessary plot points, because a scene might envelop, so multiple scenes might envelop one plot point. But it does go with rhythm and pacing, as in the amount that the dice hit the floor. And of course you can fine-tune that, because one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is, well, we kind of have, is the audience and what they want. And generally all the games that I played that were 4E, and there weren't a lot of them, they were almost constant, what I would call for Nefertiti Overdrive, loud. Like, dice were always rolling. There was always a fight. And it was almost like the Last of the Mohicans novel, where any narrative point was just to get you to another action scene. So in that, you're not even really, I don't think you're really worried too much about plot points, and the pacing is pretty high. But then it really depends on the game you're playing and your audience. If your audience prefers more role-playing, less dice, more what I would call quiet scenes, then your pacing is going to be very different if you're looking at the rhythm of the amount of mechanical tests and dice hitting the ground. I don't think the 3-act structure works really well for RPGs. I think it could for con games or something that's within a specific time frame, like we have 3 sessions to do that sort of thing. But most of the games that I'm running are relatively improv, so we're kind of going wherever the players take us.
That's sort of what I was thinking about as you were talking. There seems to be an approach for this question specifically is having those games where you know where things are supposed to end. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end to the adventure in your head before you even start. Maybe you're doing a pre-published thing, but as you say, and I do this with a lot of the games that I've been playing recently too, where it's improv, and you don't really know where things are going to go. So that way, the optimal pace that you need to hit is the pace that makes sure it's fun for everyone, or the pace where it's fun for everybody. and you don't need to worry about hitting those plot points. You don't need to worry about how far you get in an evening because oh gosh, there's all these other things I need to accomplish. There are games, Apocalypse World being one of them, where you just sort of generate things as you go along. You may say to yourselves, well, let's play a game for 6 sessions and see where we end up. And it's completely open-ended like that. So in a case like that, is there an optimal pace? No. I think in that case you might have some plot points. You say, I'd like to see, as the person running the game, you might think to yourself, oh, I'd like to see this happen tonight, or I've got a really cool idea, I want to get to this. But if you don't, it's not a big deal. You can try it next week.
I guess in something like that, in Apocalypse World, where there's a lot of narrative control for the players, the optimal pacing is the pacing that the players set. That's actually really interesting, that the players themselves can choose dynamics. It cropped up one time when we were playtesting Nefertiti Overdrive where one of the players said, can we have a fight scene here? And I was like, yeah, sure, if you want a fight scene, let's do a fight scene. So he created the fight scene where, okay, well, we're being attacked by, like, assassins dressed as ninjas. Okay, cool. I guess that's something more like Apocalypse World can do, that if they're not digging the quiet scene, they can decide.
Wouldn't that just be ninjas?
Well, except we were in ancient Egypt, so...
Does that matter?
I'm just curious. It's like sort of redundant. It's like assassins dressed as ninjas.
It's like merchants dressed as tradesmen.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you know what? That's actually something that came up too in screenplay. There was a moment where, I basically, one of the goals of the scene was for these two characters to meet, and one of the players simply came along and said, a really good way for characters to meet is over a fight scene. So can we have a fight? And sure enough, because I guess this is how characters meet in every single form of fiction. It involved ninjas, except in this case, the ninjas were like half cat and everything else like that. So yeah, I mean, and you know what? I don't remember being there for that game of Nefertiti Overdrive, so I'm guessing that was also Kieran. Kieran, that's his solution to everything. Well, why don't we just fight? I have a feeling that's how he meets his coworkers. Actually, he just does it Fight Club style. But I'm looking at this question that Victor asked and listening to how you guys are answering. I think it's actually starting to bring to light just one of the conflicts that I have with how I plan games versus how I run it. Because I plan games based on a plot point structure. To do this and to do this and to do this, and very much like how you were talking about, Chris, start with a high point, go to a low point, mix things up. If I were writing the script, this is the pace that I would write it at based on these types of scenes. But then when the moment comes and I actually start to run it, I go with the flow of what the players are presenting, where they're providing, because in some cases, whether or not it's because of dice rolls or because of how the players are simply describing what direction they want to go to, they really do determine the pace. It's a form of entertainment where you get an automatic feedback on where to go and how successful something is. If no one contributes anything to, is there anything anyone else wants to do here in the shop? Nothing? Okay, then let's move on. Let's go to something else. Whereas if everyone starts, chiming up and suddenly saying, like, I want to find a shield, I want to find a sword, I want to find a Gatling gun, you know that this is something that they're invested in, and you'll automatically go with it. So I think maybe that's more of, maybe my own internal conflict just comes with the fact that I'm obsessive compulsive about time management. And like have you guys seen the Denzel Washington version of The Equalizer?
Not yet. I haven't seen it.
Oh yeah.
Is it good?
It is awesome. Sorry, there's only one way to put it. It is fucking awesome. That's the only way to describe the movie. But in the movie, his character, he is very much obsessed with time. He's constantly, timing himself, how long it takes him to get dressed, how long it takes for him to get from point A to point B. Even when he's kicking ass, he times himself.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm very much like that with everything I do. It's why my wife won't let me wear a watch, because I'll constantly be like, it takes us exactly 22 and a half minutes to get from this point to this point, and now you're going to require us to take 26 minutes. So I'm prohibited from wearing a watch. I think I take that same concept into the game when I plan out these plot points and say, this should be enough of a pace. I think we can get through these things tonight, but I'm not counting on the fact that the way I run a game, I freeform it very much like you, Fraser. Even when it's in a structured game or even a published adventure, if people want to go in a certain direction, I'm all for it. Let's do that. It's, my improv roots really come out when I'm GMing.
Well, I mean, a published adventure or anything you've got, any notes, anything like that, it's to me, it's not a script so much as it's a reference manual. So if you need a scene, like there's some information there that you can use. But again, like no plan survives contact with the enemy, and no adventure survives contact with the players. They're going to do what they want to do, which is awesome. I mean, that's how I like to play it because it's a lot less work for me.
Yeah, yeah. Like with Lost Mines of Phandelver, when I was running that for 5e, there was a point in the game where they show up in the town, and there's the rumors going around that what were they called, the Red Coats or the Red Brand or whatever.
The Red Brands.
The Red Brands, yeah. That they're in town and they're a mean bunch of guys. Don't mess with them. They've kidnapped some people, and the barbarian in the group heard this rumor and just immediately said, "Red Brands, so the guy's wearing those capes right over there, right?" Walked right up and just took out his axe and just made an attack roll. He said, "That's it. I'm hitting him." Okay. And, of course, rolled a critical. So he beheaded the guy. I just went with the flow, and he beheaded it and started a fight, beheading a guy right then and there. And it ended up being an entire session where they basically just declared war right then and there against the Red Brands, totally went off script, and it was magnificent. It really took us kind of, like off track and everything like that, but it was just a brilliant form of improvising, using the materials and the components that were in there. That eventually, we had a cliffhanger where they were literally surrounded. I just sent all the Red Brands into town square after them. So yeah, it's one of the beauties of RPG play, in that you never know what you're going to get, and when you get something that's completely unexpected, it's a pleasure for the GM. It's also a stressor.
I think it really depends on the GM. So Victor's current question, do we think it's easier to pace for something that's more improv or more planned? I have a really easy time improving. Whether it's planned a pre-published adventure, like in 4E or 5E, or something improv like Nefertiti Overdrive or Apocalypse World. I think there are people who and I know there are people who have a really hard time improving. So it's kind of a difficult question. I mean, I think for this group, I think it's safe for me to say specifically about this group of people that it's easy to improv, or easier to pace something, whether it's planned or improv.
Yeah, I think it just depends on. I think the key difference really is, are you playing a game that whatever I get done today doesn't matter because we'll finish it the next session and the next session and the next session, or is it, I have 4 hours at a con game, and it really doesn't matter if you get it finished, but if you're trying to give the players there sort of an overall impression of accomplishing something, then I think the pacing is important.
Yeah.
And and also hitting those plot points. Like if you get there and the game, because I've been to those con games where you get there, it bogs down, you have like one fight, and you don't really feel like you've done anything other than, roll some dice for 4 hours. It's one thing, if you know the system, but if you're trying to say, hey, this is a game I've never played before, and all you do is kind of get halfway through a fight or through one fight, that to me sort of is a waste of time because it's not giving you a really good impression of the game. So I think there the pacing is more important, and I think there it is. I think you do need to have some sort of plot point set out to keep the game on track.
And you also can't be afraid to, for instance, the fight scene that you realize has gone on for 2 hours.
Yeah, just end it.
To just shut it down. Yeah.
Right. And I think then, because in our groups, we have this sort of established group dynamic. So there is a lot of ways we riff off each other. I mean, I know when I'm running a game, right now if we're going through a canned adventure, I kind of follow along with the canned adventure, but when something comes up, I throw it in. Or if you guys come up with some idea, I throw it in. If you're at a con game, those sort of elements aren't going to come up that often because you generally are leading those people through. They're following your lead. Very, very rarely are they the ones running the game. Or even really contributing. They're more reactionary, especially if it's a game they've never played before. So I think in that sort of aspect, I I think you do need to have more of a planned out sort of like a this is what we want to do. And I was just thinking now, and I don't know if I've never tried this, but I'm wondering, like here's the adventure. Like say you go to a movie, you watch the trailer, you have an idea of what that movie's about. I'm wondering now if you went into like, a one-off session, be it a con game or with your buddies, and said, hey, this is what tonight's adventure is about. You're storming the castle, and it's filled with zombies, and you wouldn't necessarily have to give it to them in a very kind of point of fashion. You could say spend maybe the 20 minutes where you're sort of setting stuff up and say these are the town rumors and kind of lay out the like the trailer, as you will, within the game itself, so that the players sort of have an idea of what they're expected to accomplish, so that they don't get bogged down in town spending half an hour negotiating for healing potions, because that doesn't matter, because the scope of the game is get to the castle, kill the zombies, save the princess.
I mean, you could certainly set that out as a goal, and like you mentioned, I mean, when this topic came up, one of the things that I did mention was con games, because for myself, that's the only time where there's a time constraint on it, specifically of 4 hours. And I think for con games, you do need structure. Like, you can improv, but there needs to be structure, because you need to, like, yes, you have 4 hours for a con game, you really have 3.5, because if you plan for 4 hours, you got 4.5. So you plan for 3.5. There's a lot of things that has to happen within that 3.5 hours. So that there does need to be structure to that, and that's for me. That's not the same as when I'm playing a regular game, because it can go over. But I think con game and con game planning is something that can be an entire episode in and of itself. But I mean, at least for pacing is important in a con game. And like you said, Chris, there's certain things, like if you're teaching a game, there's certain things you have to do. There's certain things that you want to hit, and then you want to have a satisfying conclusion. Right. And that's why I don't really like improving without structure, because if you don't have an end point, you're not going to have a satisfying conclusion. But I mean, for Victor's question of pacing, I think in an improv game, and again, if we're talking about time constraints like a con, which is I think the best example that I can provide, if we are talking about time constraints, I think pacing is more difficult in a improv game, because you don't know where it's going to go, which is why you need to impose structure on it. Whereas but even something like 4E, I think, and I didn't play it enough, so I don't know. I think that a fight might end up being much longer or much shorter than you expect, or at least any kind of mechanical interaction. So I think that can be difficult as well. But of the two, I think pacing with 4E is probably easier, because and again, this is specifically my experience with it, because there wasn't much of a rhythm to it, because it was mostly action after action after action, with cartilage keeping those bones together, and not a lot of, and it didn't really, this is a whole other discussion anyways, but it didn't really engender role-playing anyways.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and you were just mentioning about endings, Fraser, and that's something I find in my experience with playing improv games versus very structured games like 4E, is the conclusion in an improv game is almost always, okay, that's it, and we're done, and boom, and the book's closed. Whereas with 4E, the ending always seems to keep up with the pace that you've expected, that you've been building up to over X number of sessions and everything like that. And it's also something I find with con games especially too, because time, aside from the fact of teaching people how to play, there's the inevitable, okay, so hold on, what was this again? And taking a break to explain something. There's always these additional little pauses as people kind of stumble over the first little bit of the rules. Those games, I always find that the conclusion is almost always a really kind of, bam, that's it, roll credits. It always, to me, comes across as a bit more of a disappointment, because it's taken you so long to get to this point, but you need to now kind of rush because, well, here we are, we're at this conclusion, and I don't want to cliffhang in the middle of a conclusion and then drag it out for maybe another 4 hours next session. You want to start to wrap this up. I kind of find when it comes to that's the one area where improv games, in my history with them, has always kind of been the one disappointment. It's very much like, sex with someone for the first time. It's great while you get going with it, but the next thing you know, one of you is finished and the other one's not even close, and you both just walk away disappointed.
Yeah,
Too much
you're on your own
information,
there.
buddy.
Totally on your own.
This is common, right? We have all experienced this, yes?
Sure, yeah, sure, no problem. Got your back there, pal.
Right.
And this is now recorded for posterity too.
For prosperity, yep.
Prosperity.
Now that's also been recorded. Excellent.
Exactly. But again, this is a whole thing. Like con games is a whole topic on its own, and I think you can improv with con games, and I have improv with con games, but it's really, really important to have structure because, and again, you aim for 3.5 hours. You don't aim for 4 hours because, like you said, that leaves really unsatisfying. With okay, and you hit him. Okay, it's dead. Okay, thanks, goodbye. Where you can have a denouement with the characters if that's considered important, but when it gets to like pacing with regular like a campaign or whatever, you don't want to do a Lord of the Rings or Return of the King denouement, but you certainly do want to have some kind of ending, even if the characters are going to continue on into another campaign, like a lot of long campaigns do. But you do want to have some level of conclusion, a satisfying conclusion for the characters. It can be a lot shorter in a con because the people aren't as invested because they're generally pre-generated characters. Whereas if you've got like a regular home game where they've invested in these characters for 4 or 5 or 6 sessions or a year or 2 years, you definitely want to have the time and you want to have planned some kind of satisfying denouement for them.
Stop saying that word.
Denouement.
Yeah. Now, actually, Victor's also.
It's terrible.
Victor's also added a little something here. 4E was easier to pace at low levels, but the higher the characters got, the more erratic pacing got. And I would definitely agree with that. I remember actually.
Where are you getting that from?
Where am I getting that from? That's been from Victor.
Yeah.
It says there right in the screen.
It's in the Q&A.
It's black and white.
Hey, I'm a regular enough now. I can just pitch right in and start reading what people are writing. But anyways, yeah, that was something I do very much agree with in that case because I remember one summer just for like a weekend cottage game, I said, okay, you know what? Go straight. Make a 30th level character. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go kill Orcus. And that was the theme of the weekend. And it was so insanely out of control that they wiped the floor with it. It was impossible to predict what was going to happen. They killed Orcus, and I had to double up his hit points at the last minute. So in that particular case, yes, that was a particular weakness of 4E. And maybe it's something you can even say about structured games as a whole, is that they can sometimes be so structured that if one little thing goes off the beaten path, it can have a huge detrimental effect. And if that offset just compounds on itself, eventually you actually end up with something that's completely broken. You might as well just be completely improvising it at that point.
Yes.
Speaking of pacing.
I know. Right? Well, was that our denouement?
Oh, Jesus. So, how about them Jays?
Yeah.
But again, like Victor also wrote for con games, I tend to do planned out events that might happen. And if the players take off on their own, great. But if not, I have things for them to do. I hate for a group to feel like they never accomplished anything. And again, like, wow, con games. There's so much prep and concern that goes into them. But I think that's a good point for almost any game, especially when you have an improv game. Now, for most of the planning that I did for the Nefertiti Overdrive playtest, for the League of Extraordinary Misfits playtest, it was, and I've spoken about this before, I think, Chris, you do kind of the same thing, is the one-pager, which gives you kind of the hooks that you need if things slow down, like, okay, well, there's this thing, there's this NPC, or there's this event, or something that you can pull on, or something that got them excited last time, that can always pop up. And again, like, if you're not talking about, and this is the difficulty that I had with the question to begin with, if you're not talking about a con game, I don't understand where there's a time constraint. If there's the feeling that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, because my interest is always in people having fun. The socializing that goes on in the games that we've done during my playtests have never really been a problem, because generally we're looking at like a year, 2 years that we're going to be investing in this thing anyways.
Yeah. And I was going to say I generally agree with that, but I know we've had run sessions where we get a lot accomplished, and we get only a little bit of things accomplished, and it's not that people aren't enjoying themselves for the evening, but there is a difference, and I think that if everybody's getting together with the purpose of gaming, and you actually get a lot of gaming done, I think that is a different feeling you walk away with that night than if you just got together, you did very little, and you had, not saying you're not having fun for that whole time, but I think there is a difference. So I think pacing, even if you are, just there to have fun, it is a factor, because I personally think there is a difference. Because I know, like, if I'm running a game, like our last session, we, it kind of started out a little bit slow, but then we kind of busted through. Everybody kind of got on board and was pretty much engaged with everything, and I kept pushing the pace and throwing stuff at them and pulling, and they were pushing, and the last hour of the night or whatever it was hour of rapid fire gaming was, the whole evening was fun, but that to me was a more memorable ending than if we'd kind of, all right, we got to the thing, and you kind of plodded along, and you fought a couple guys, and then you're back to it the next session. So I think that even though, regardless of how your evening goes on, people are being entertained, there is a difference.
I would agree too, and I think that is one of the biggest dangers of improv gaming, is allowing wheels to spin. And when I improv game, it's not structureless, because there's always the concern that the players aren't going to know where they want to go, and that's why you have to have some level of structure. It's just like anything. It's like seat of the pants writing versus creating an outline or whatever. You have your outline so that you know where you're going, and as long as you know where you're going, if they're losing their way, you can insert, again, like I said, have a transitional scene, an NPC, something like that can kind of get them back on course. So yeah, I think there's definitely a danger with, especially with improv gaming, of allowing things to meander, and then people don't feel that they've accomplished that much. And yes, I agree about that. And that certainly can be a pacing issue. But I don't know if I don't think that's as much of a problem with people that are planners as opposed to those of us that improv like crazy.
Yeah, I have a theory when it comes to people who have a fear or an anxiety about improving, and it's very much the same way. It's the people who don't like to call and order pizza. Anyone can actually call and order pizza, but when you don't have to, you don't want to. If you've got someone else that'll call for you, then calling to order your own pizza, just because, I said to her, like, you can go ahead and order your own pizza. I'm just going to go and have podcasts with the guys. And she's like, no, I don't want to. I always feel awkward. So anyways, I'm just kind of divulging into my own personal issues. But I really do find that there's a lot of people who have this anxiety about, because there's improving at all levels of role-playing GMing, in all levels. Like the game doesn't tell you exactly what happens if a player rolls this value on this particular attack roll. So I think it's something where, I think everyone's got, there's always a hybrid of in between. There's always a certain level of structure that everyone works with. Now, even in an improvised game, you know what the other characters who you have created, unless you have created or running a complete and total improv game where nothing was written in advance, there's no NPC stats or anything, you always know a rough direction of where the storyline is going to lead if no one else interjects at these various points in time. And at the same time, too, in a very structured game, you have enough information to work with that if things kind of really start to stray in a certain direction, you have enough to either be able to bring it back or in the case of my players with the red brands, to say, okay, well, I'm going to take this volume of information. They're clearly not going this way with it, but I can still use it to go in this direction that they've turned us towards. There's always a mixture in some way, shape, or form. I know my main concern has always just been, I find sometimes, it's when we start to stray off the path, I worry that by letting us stray, that I'm kind of taking us so far away that we're not going to be able to find the main road again. And I don't know, once again, maybe it just kind of comes down to my self-pressure to time management, everything. Maybe that's just me, so I don't know if you guys feel that's the same way.
No, well, that's just you.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've never really, again, and in general, if there's something that you want to accomplish in a particular session, I can understand that. And if you only had, for example, 4 sessions in which to play test your game, then I can also see that. Or, for example, somebody's moving away or something like that, and you want to get these things done. I can understand in those instances. I have a hard time, again, as I've repeatedly said, because I generally look at a year, 2 years that I'm going to be following this campaign that I have a very loose structure for. I know where it's going. Even when people, for example, decide that let's go to Romania and meet Frankenstein, it's like, wow, I never thought of that, but okay, let's do that. It doesn't necessarily throw me off what I expect as the target. So I think there are ways to, and again, for me, it all comes back to milestones and goals. So for me, if there's a goal, if there's something that you feel you need to accomplish within a time frame, you set your milestones and you look at those milestones, you decide your timings, and then you work within that. To me, that makes sense. And there are lots of ways of, if you're improv gaming, of using structure, of using exciting scenes, of using transitional NPCs to draw people back to the main road, as you said, if they're off on the side. One of the biggest problems, I guess, is that I haven't really encountered this. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example in my own, like in my own games where this happened, and I'm pretty sure it did, like, back in the day. But I think that recently, and a lot of it has to do with the crew that I've assembled in Ottawa and the crew that I had in Kitchener, that it hasn't really happened recently. I mean, when you have people that basically burn down cities around them, there's always excitement.
Yeah. That's why we do it, because we know Fraser's got nothing.
Exactly. We better light this place on fire.
First session.
Yeah. What are you going to do? I'm going to fucking stare at that merchant until Fraser gives us something. Nothing? All right, burn it down.
Until he starts giving us simpler NPC names.
Yeah.
Fine, beat up the elderly. That's what I'm doing.
I know that was something with the Ottawa game. Sometimes we'd look at each other and say, like, oh, we need a little more time to figure this out. Quick, come up with something so that Fraser can give us a little history lesson on the setting and buy us about 5 to 10 minutes so we can come up with an idea.
That backfired, though, because instead of 5 to 10 minutes, they got 30 to 60 minutes.
And a written essay afterwards.
Which was marked.
Yeah.
There was a test on it at the end of the session.
Your experience will be graded accordingly on this.
Yeah, if I ever have to go back and get, like, retake high school history all over again, I'm going to fail miserably because my version of ancient Egypt is going to have ninjas in it.
Ninja assassins dressed as...
Yes, ninja assassins. Right. Hey, that was actually a movie title. That can't be too much of a stretch. Come on.
That's right. That's true. Well, I guess you could have, like, ninja bakers, ninja cooks. It's like like anybody else, right? You just don't have...
That's right, because they're a race.
Yeah, exactly.
What do ninjas do on their downtime?
Very cool. Well, do we have any more that we want to discuss with pacing?
Well, here's something. Here's something I want to throw out, and it's actually. Oh, I know. When it does come to improv gaming,
I have a 10 gig Star Wars Battlefront beta to start downloading, and I can't get it started until this podcast is done.
Hey, listen, buddy. If I don't get to play, you don't get to play. That's how this works. But when it does come
Sorry.
to improv gaming, and you're letting players basically have a lot more narrative control than you would in a structured game. As a GM, what advice would you guys have to kind of help keep them moving forward at a good pace? Because it is possible to sometimes for them to kind of meander and get lost, or also too just maybe if they're not used to it from as players to have that kind of narrative control. Because this is something that I have experienced a couple of times with running screenplay for players. And it's also something that I just have a little bit of, once again, a little anxiety because I'm about to actually send it out there and let it go public.
My advice would be to learn. It's a very tricky thing, but to learn when to start clipping scenes, and I'm just kind of figuring that out now. So you don't always have to let the fight run all the way through. Typically, like often fights will be quick, but it doesn't have to be a fight. I'm just thinking like fights are the obvious sort of action scene, but don't be afraid that if the fight is dragging, end it. Have something happen that the PCs still get to feel like they've succeeded. If they're winning, if they're getting their butts kicked, don't do a 180. But if they're already doing well in the fight, maybe the bad guys run away. If the evening's drawing long, or they're just getting, if whatever they're doing, regardless of the type of scene it is, end it before it goes over that point where that scene is no longer interesting and it starts to bog down. The trick is learning where that happens, and it's easier to do that with an established group because you kind of know the patterns, because suddenly the Joe of the group starts talking about what he's doing on the weekend because he's now kind of gotten bored with that moment. So you can learn those cues, and that's when you start clipping that scene. Because if Joe gets bored, then he's going to draw Steve with him, and then and then it derails, and then the two people left that are actually kind of pushing to end that fight, they're starting to get annoyed that Joe and Steve are talking about what movies are coming up. So my advice would be to see those sort of patterns and then clip the scene. Regardless of what's going on, clip it and end it, as long as that, however it ends, logically follows what's happened up until that point. Or I guess you could do a total 180, but then be prepared to back up why that suddenly, whatever happened, like the rocks fell, ceiling collapsed, whatever. Just do it in such a way that you don't feel like you're penalizing the players. You're actually, you're not penalizing the players. You're giving the characters something else to do.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
It's easy easier, as you say, to do that with an established group because you start to know the people and you understand when they're kind of wandering. With a group that you're not familiar with, it's tougher because maybe Joe is just naturally quiet.
Yeah.
You think maybe he's bored, but he's just naturally doesn't like to get involved in the decision-making process. He just wants to sort of follow along and tell me what to do, tell me when to roll the dice, and I'll roll the dice and I'll have fun doing that. It's a lot trickier in the situation in a con game where you won't necessarily know the people at the table. There are certain there's some body language that you could learn to recognize whether it's leaning back from the table and crossing their arms, or getting more and more fidgety. These are other things you can look out for, and when you see that happening, you can see even in that the way somebody's sitting at the table, whether they're leaning forward and engaged, or leaning back and picking at their fingernails.
They're checking their phone.
Yeah. As soon as
contact.
that's a big one. As soon as someone pulls out their phone and starts playing, Candy Crush, or checking the situation in their vault, to make sure their Fallout vault, to make sure they have, they've gotten their water and their electricity is running fine. Then okay, I need to pull this person back in. You can't do it every time though, because you also have to get, if there's 3 or 4 other people sitting at the table, you also need to keep them involved. So it's a tough balance, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
Another thing that you had mentioned, like them going off the reservation, off the road, outside of what you were expecting, and trying to get them back in. That's one of the reasons why I think hooks, like character hooks, are really important. Histories, interests, anything like that. And I mean, some games have those as part of the characters. And if you have those in your back pocket, again, like a little bit of prep, even in an improv game, if you want it to go smoothly, really helps. Sorry, what?
Oh, just reading John's comment.
Yeah. And as our listeners won't be able to read John's comment, I'll read it. Listener John has... there it goes. So in summary, well-prepared GMs have Gantt charts with milestones based on false history that is promptly abandoned in the first moments in favor of winging it. You have all worked for a government, haven't you?
I certainly have.
Or higher education, any kind of corporate position.
But anyways, the hooks can help. Use those in your back pocket. Like if people are getting off the story and you're trying to get their attention back, pull out the hook for that character, and that will get their attention generally. Now, having Gantt charts with milestones based on false history promptly abandoned the first moments in favor of winging it. Oh yeah, absolutely. But you've got the Gantt charts and the milestones based on false history to fall back on when you're winging it. Finally falls flat in its face.
When Joe and Steve get bored.
Exactly.
And you need something to you fall back on that Gantt chart. Say, okay, well, we're at this point. Let's pull this in now.
And the one thing I've started to do a little bit, and if you're already in the middle of a campaign, it doesn't work as well. Except when you're kind of going through these transition scenes, instead of telling the players why they're there, like this is what your character's doing, ask the players, like, why is your character here? How did you guys come to this conclusion? Why are you adventuring together? Don't force it. Don't try to force the issue for them to buy into your story. Let them come up with their own story, because then that will help create, that creates the investment on their end. It gives them the buy-in.
And not only that, it makes the job of the GM easier.
Oh, absolutely, because the GM already has a couple things they're doing.
Yeah, they're keeping track of other things, and as soon as you say, okay, I'm putting this in your hands, it can go either way, I think. A lot of players love that sort of stuff. They go, okay, yeah, this is why I'm here. But then another player might just go, I don't know.
But you can help those guys along. Like, these are 4 reasons you might be there. Or, these guys are here because of da-da-da-da, so why do you think, maybe this guy, maybe, previously you worked with them on a job or whatever. So I think you don't have to necessarily expect the whole group to kind of buy into it, but if you even get half of them, you can help the other ones along quite a bit. And in the number of games, like our group, we all started out playing D&D because that was sort of the game, and then some of us kind of always played D&D, and others have started pulling in other games and sort of not the rules specifically, but sort of that the game itself, the inspiration back into D&D. So now we've got players that are very much like, well, it says on my character sheet I can do ABC, and I will do ABC, whereas other guys are bringing more to the table, because at the end of the day, if you're hitting the guy for 5 damage, be as descriptive as you want. If there's no mechanic behind it, do what you want. And as a group matures and you kind of get to know each other, that you can sort of build on this. But even if you've never played with these people before, if you start putting the ball in their court, some of them will grab to it because they may have never played a game before, and so they don't know that this is traditionally wrong. And even others that have, they might have. You've got that guy that's the rules lawyer who's been playing D&D his whole life. Well, give him the ball, see what he does with it. You can always clip it back or draw him in, but you've now given him that power because you have some guy that's, say if you're a stranger in a game session, and this is kind of deviating from the original topic, but if you're a stranger to a game session and you don't know anybody, you have giving that person a bit of power. They can then use that to put themselves into the game. If they get out of control, you can always kind of curb it a bit. But if you don't give them anything to go on and you're just kind of throwing rules and settings at them and they feel out of control, that will do far more to drive them away than if you let them. If you are the one, if they're the ones that feel that they have the power.
Oh.
Is Fraser gone?
No, I'm here.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
No, he passed out.
It was all that ransom juice.
Yep.
Yeah.
The ransom juice. That was you were supposed to free me. You drank all the freedom money.
Oh, liquid freedom.
Liquid freedom. Wasn't that Samuel Adams? Liquid freedom.
Oh, I don't even want to go there, man. Some of those.
A long time ago.
Yeah. Anyways, fuck Brussels. All right. Well, any last thoughts before we close up? Before we reach our denouement?
Apparently Todd is not a demon in the sack. Until you get to know him, maybe. That was my
What?
takeaway. The demon in the sack. That was my takeaway.
Yeah, I heard you. I must have missed something before I. There must have been something that happened before I got online and joined the conversation.
There was a confession. A little awkward. Not
Yeah,
gonna lie.
no, unfortunately you were present for it, Rob, but I appreciate the fact that you mentally blocked it out because I'm
Was
really
that what that
hoping
was?
that I'm going to forget too.
It was so traumatic. He blocked it out.
That might have been surfing Reddit at that point when you.
I think you were checking on your Battlefront download. That's what
like
it was at this point.
my finger hovering over the preload button.
Yeah, all I remember is 86%. That's all I remember.
As soon as this is done, I am so gone.
No
All
last thoughts. No last thoughts. But maybe yes. There's what it was everything else we talk about. There's no hard and fast answer. It's not black and white. Everything.
I'm right.
Well, aside from the fact that you're wrong. No, it's different for everybody. Whether some people are really good at pacing things and preparing, and some people need to stick to those prepared plot points and need to hit them. And if it doesn't happen, then the wheels fall off and everything falls apart. And we've seen it happen before in our own groups. And then there are people who are really excellent at just rolling with the punches, because I think for a lot of game masters, people running tabletop RPGs, you have to be, and especially with games like Nefertiti and various Apocalypse World hacks, you absolutely have to be ready to roll with the punches because you have no idea where things are going to go. The games are designed to be like that.
Very true.
Yeah.
Wise
Yeah.
words. Mr.
Yeah,
Wakefield.
I think for myself too, and like I said, having been brought this topic up was just because of a little bit of self-anxiety about how I run games. And I think what you guys have taught me is that it's all in my head, much like my paranoia about my performance in the sack. Clearly, everything I'm doing is totally fine. And
When you're in the shower, are you afraid to wash your hair?
Or do you watch it for way too long?
Our hot water bill's been pretty high. But no, I think it's one of those things where maybe I am kind of reading a little too much into this, and when it does come down to it, I mean, like let's face it, no one's bailed ship on me for quite a long time, and I'm talking about both marriage and players. So maybe it is just something where it's an internal thing, or it's just me, just kind of being obsessive compulsive, maybe even just being a control freak.
I think a lot of times it's never as bad as you think it is, and that means both at the table and in the sack.
Wow, my wife is not going to listen to this episode at all. How'd your podcast go? The guys bailed at the last minute.
They forgot to hit record.
Yeah. Mistakes were made. I'm not going to lie.
Podcast? What podcast? I was having an affair. What are you talking about?
I was at the pornography store. I was buying pornography.
Very cool. All right. Well, good night from Fraser.
Good night from Chris.
Oh, go ahead, Todd. I came in last, so I'll say.
Okay. So we go in chronological order with these.
Apparently, Todd never comes in last.
Oh!
All night I've been waiting for that. All night.
Oh!
Which is what she said.
And hanging his head low. God.
You gonna say goodnight or just leave us hanging?
Yeah, that was it. That was my most pathetic goodnight.
Okay. Good night from Rob.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Todd.
Sure, pick on the new guy.
It's not the first time he's heard someone say that to him.
Yeah,
And it
was
wasn't the same tone.
Todd. It was
Just like
Todd.
Todd.
All right. Good night.
Ciao.